One of the most common, the oldest, and probably, in my opinion, the strongest objection an atheist would have to the idea of an omnibenevolent God would be the idea of the problem of evil. And this, again, has been a very old argument put forth by atheists and skeptics in an attempt to logically disprove the idea that a God who is supposedly omnibenevolent and evil can coexist at the same time. So, the very basic premises of the problem of evil goes a little something like this. Premise 1, this God is supposedly omnibenevolent. Premise 2, this God is supposedly omnipotent. Premise 3, this God is supposedly omniscient. Conclusion, it is therefore logically impossible for evil and suffering to exist with a God that is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving. Now you might be asking, well, what's the issue with the problem of evil? Why is it relevant today? Well, to be quite honest, it has been circulating around YouTube for quite some time now, but it hasn't been brought to light until fairly recently, I'd say within a year or so, when it was put into the spotlight by one Dr. William Lane Craig, who I have yet to really discuss in my videos. But first, I'd like to establish a few things that hopefully even my detractors will agree upon. Firstly, I will use the words evil and suffering in this context interchangeably. I will also assume, for the purposes of illustration, that the judeo-christian God exists. Now, I'm not going to say that this does not necessarily apply with any other god in existence, but I want to focus on the Judeo-Christian God mainly because it's usually the Christians that put forth some objections to the problem of evil. Make no mistake, though, this can apply essentially to most gods of most religions. I'm just singling on Christianity because it happens to be the easiest to demonstrate. Finally, I would like to establish that evil and suffering do exist in the world, because if you want to argue over the whole philosophical idea of does suffering exist, does evil exist, then we will honestly get nowhere. But for the purposes of illustration, evil and suffering do exist. Now, while a person's capacity to measure the amount of suffering they have is completely subjective, what is not subjective is the suffering itself. So, for example, you don't have to feel like you're dying for me to be able to objectively tell you that you are dying. So, objection number one goes a little something like this. God is the creator of the universe. He can do whatever the hell he wants. Now, this isn't the most common response I hear, but it is probably the easiest one I can respond to, and probably, hopefully, anyone with half a brain could do the same thing. This is essentially predicated upon a false comparison between us and the things we create. I mean, mankind creates and destroys the things we create all the time, right? So technically God can do the same thing to us, right? Well, no. Again, this is a false comparison. Machines can't feel pain. Machines are not aware of their surroundings. Machines do not comprehend suffering. We do. And really, just because God created us does not mean he has the right to do whatever the hell he wants to us. If you guys still don't understand why this is such a problem, allow me to illustrate it in an analogy. Let's just say a father and his wife conceive a child who is now 8 years old. He gets completely sick and tired of dealing with the child and says, "I want to kill you." And the child says, "Why? I haven't done anything wrong." And he says, "Well, I created you. I can do whatever I want to you." Does that sound like moral accountability to you? Does that sound like something you would completely forgive this father for doing? Just because he felt tired and did not want to deal with his kid, and because he created that child, he has the right to do whatever the hell he wants to it? Of course not. And I'm sure most of you would hopefully say that you would not condone such behavior. So why would you condone it with your God? doesn't really make sense now, does it? The second objection I hear is, well, we deserve it. We deserve suffering. So this would, I would say, be more prevalent with the theists involved, again, in the Abrahamic religions, more specifically Christianity and Islam. And this is, again, fairly easy to respond to. So, going with the whole story of Adam and Eve, would you say that it's ethical that we deserve to suffer as they did when they did something wrong? Does that sound like justice to you? I'd hope not. The third objection I hear is that we need evil and suffering. Without evil, there can be no good. Without suffering, there can be no happiness. Okay, let's say I accept that. So, serial killers, who many of them do get away with what they've done, draw immense amounts of pleasure from making people absolutely miserable. And they are the scum of the earth, and they've lived happy, wonderful lives. While people who are nice, who happen to be noble and kind and generous, and maybe in even some instances religious, often die painful, miserable deaths. So, yes, let's say I accept this idea of balance, it does nothing to explain why the evil and suffering in this world is so unevenly distributed. Fourth would have to be my favorite one, and the most common response I hear would be free will. Ah, the free will defense. So, what is this exactly? Well, I'm sure you've heard it before if you are involved in this sort of conversation, but for those of you who haven't, it goes a little something like this. God wanted his creation to have the free will to choose between accepting or rejecting him, and since people often like to indulge in sin, then it is a product of our selfishness and indulgence that evil and suffering therefore do exist. But it is our fault because we have the free will to choose between suffering and evil versus happiness and being with God, and we just chose wrong. Okay, so now we established that evil is apparently a requisite of free will that God has so kindly given to us. So, without evil, we therefore do not have the free will to do what we please, and God does not want to restrict our freedom. So, therefore, without evil, we don't have free will. Okay, so I'd have to ask, what about heaven? Doesn't free will exist there without evil unless you're willing to admit that there is evil in heaven or people in heaven don't have free will? What about your God? Does your God not have free will or is he evil? So, these two things essentially completely destroy the idea that evil and free will must exist together. And if you would be so inclined to say that, well, heaven and God are the only exceptions where evil and free will do not have to exist together, then that's called special pleading, isn't it? In which I can say, with an equal amount of validity, that, well, I can make another special exception for humanity as well, that we do not need to be evil in order to have the free will to choose what we want to do. So, if you want to play this game of making special cases and trying to exonerate your God through pleading, then you honestly aren't going to get anywhere. The fifth and final objection has to be the most morally reprehensible of them all, and that is that God works in mysterious ways. So, God has his own way of doing things, we should not question it. The first question that really comes to mind is, if God has his own ways and we shouldn't question it, why should we even follow it if we don't know what it entails? Are we just supposed to put our trust in some God who might not even necessarily be in it to help humanity? Maybe it's an evil God. What makes you so sure it's not an evil God? Again, you're taking it completely on faith. And I can say with an equal amount of validity, therefore, that because you don't understand the will of an omniscient, omnipotent God, that you cannot say for sure that this God is necessarily trying to help humanity. This therefore also raises the question of why theists would want to attribute this God with being all-loving or a loving God while allowing evil and suffering to exist at the same time. Because not only is there absolutely no proof to suggest that this God is even willing to help humanity, but theists essentially are holding a double standard when they say that this God is all-loving. How could you possibly comprehend the ideas, the concepts, and the will of an all-powerful God? How can you say that this God is all-loving if you yourself don't understand its will? There is really only one cop-out to this, and I'd have to honestly say it's pretty hilarious, and that would be to redefine the word loving as most like God. The thing that God would most likely do. Okay, so that essentially means that when you say God is loving, God is most like himself. Well, that's informative. The moral implications of this whole God is mysterious excuse is fairly reprehensible, to say the least. So, by that definition, everything we do can essentially be considered part of God's plan, otherwise, there would be nothing that he wouldn't know because he's all knowing. So, everything was planned, from all the earthquakes and tsunamis that killed millions of innocent people to the serial killers and rapists that caused the suffering and harm of many innocent people again. This was all part of God's brilliant plan. Then essentially, what won't you classify as evil? Or what won't you classify as suffering? Because in that case, every murder, every rape, every instance of human suffering that has occurred and will occur in the future can essentially be considered good. And of course, the question that follows would be, what couldn't you justify with that sort of logic? If I decided to use that logic, as many of history's worst dictators have, and say, well, I work in mysterious ways, don't question me, I'm just doing this for the benefit of humanity. You couldn't possibly understand my will. What would you think of me? What would people think of me? And if you're, again, going to try and cop out by using special pleading, then sorry, that's not going to work. Because if you are going to make a case where I cannot use that logic because I'm a human and God can do whatever the hell he wants, then once again I'll have to say, why can't I make a case of special pleading for myself? Because I'm above all you human peons, so I can do and whatever the hell I want, and you guys should not question my logic. So what has become of the problem of evil, which was once just a simple problem of logic, being that omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence cannot coexist together with evil and suffering? What has become of that problem is a whole array of arguments that have been repeated ad nauseum. Hopefully, I've done a decent job in addressing these arguments, but if you haven't, or maybe if you think I've missed something, feel free to let me know in the comments section. Thanks for watching, guys, and may the truth always be heard. Later.